Good morning. Welcome to Law Power Hour. I am really excited to share my guest with you. Uh, I don't know if I should call him the Honorable Jeffrey Collins, but I will. Former judge of the Wayne County Circuit Court, former chief judge, Michigan Court of Appeals, United States Attorney for our district, and private practitioner. Thank you for coming today.
Well, I'm excited to be here, and you can feel free to call me Jeff.
Well, I'm going to call you
I'm
Jeff
in the
now.
capacity of Jeff.
First time I met you, you had a robe on and you were trying to help my client. And I was so impressed that you were trying to talk my client out of pleading guilty.
Well, I have fond memories of my time serving on the bench. There are a lot of cases, and as a judge, sometimes you can get kind of lost in thinking you have such a huge docket, but for that client or that defendant, that's
Yes.
their only case, and so you just want to make sure that on each particular case that you treat them fairly and justly. And I hope I did so in the case in which you appeared in front of me.
I have an important question to ask you, and I think it's important for our audience to understand this. First of all, I want everybody to understand that you practice with your wife today, correct?
I sure do.
And she is committed to work with you in your practice, and you do a lot of community work as well.
We have a good community outreach mission as a part of our law practice. I was very fortunate, I think, to go to, one of the premier civil rights law schools in the nation, Howard University. And
The premier.
Thurgood Marshall, one of the famous graduates. And one thing that was implanted at Howard was not just the desire to go out as an attorney and make money, but also to use your degree to try to effectuate social change, to try to have a positive impact on others. And my wife, Attorney Lois Collins, reflects that same philosophy. And we have, through our law office, done a lot of work in particular with our church, Plymouth United Church of Christ. We have been directors of our church camp for 17 years.
Now, that's a real commitment, 17 years to be involved in a church camp. I served in two capacities, one as a synagogue president and the other one on the Sacred Heart Board for many years. And it was trying, but running a camp is a little different.
You take off the coat and tie, you're sleeping outdoors, you're out there with nature, but it's a great experience, for kids to get away from the hustle of city life and see, life from a different lens. And we try to have a host of activities that would give them, something to remember for forever. I'm very proud of what we've been able to do through the camp.
Now, where's your office located?
Our office is downtown Detroit on Broadway. We converted a loft into a law office. It's between Gratiot and Grand River, 1323 Broadway, right in the heart of the rebuild of downtown Detroit.
Now, with the rebuild going on, do you feel that the intrusion, and I use the word intrusion, of all of the commuters, I call them the ex-urbanites, into the city is having a negative impact upon the community?
Well,
And I said that. I meant what I said.
I agree, and I understand what the word intrusion, but I try to look at it slightly differently. I look at it more as inclusion than exclusion, and having more people come downtown from different geographic backgrounds who may not have normally come downtown for either social activities or, more importantly, to live. In the building in which our office is in, I mean, we're the only commercial tenant, but there are also other residents who live there who are coming from the suburbs to live in Detroit. And there's a waiting list, to get in our building. So it's in high demand. And I think that more influx of people coming into the city is a good thing. What I do hope, though, is that the next step in terms of the city's growth is to, have that same sense of resources and development dedicated to the neighborhoods. You know, so you don't have the abandoned homes. That you have shopping that you can walk to. That you have parks and recs right here in the city of Detroit. You know that you're very proud of. So
Well, that's been my big gripe, and I've mentioned it on the air, that those who have, and I'm talking about developers in the city, those who have the resources aren't effectively, and I'm saying this, and maybe they're not going to agree with me, but they're not effectively going out to the suburbs, to the communities. They're not going out Gratiot. They're not going out Grand River. They're not going out into the neighborhoods and making an investment in the neighborhoods, which I think is really, really important, in addition to making an investment downtown so that the entire city can benefit from growth. The entire city can benefit from development. People can feel free to get a cup of coffee over on Gratiot, or they can go on Schoolcraft or Grand River and feel comfortable in their neighborhood. And that's been the biggest problem.
I agree that there should be more an investment in the neighborhoods, but you have to start somewhere. And what has happened in downtown Detroit? If you look at downtown Detroit now as compared to 10 years ago, it looks totally different. So there's growth there, which I take as positive. But it can't just stop there. It has to extend to Gratiot. It has to extend down Grand River. It has to go up and down the Woodward corridor. Very often I ride my bike to work, which is about an 8-mile ride. I live in Detroit, but it's about an 8-mile ride to downtown Detroit. And I go through all the neighborhoods, and I can see areas of blight, but I also can see pockets of promise as well. And I just think one of the next challenges as the city moves forward is to spread that growth so it does reach everyone.
If we spread the growth, we'll be able to get more people working. I mean, there are a limited number of projects. I mean, Dan Gilbert is working with the unions and working with the Board of Education right now because we need more skilled tradespeople to do the development, to complete the projects in the city. I know there's a program going on through the Detroit Board of Education over at the Randolph School right now with 600 individuals, 300 students and 300 adults being trained for the skilled trades. But that's just a drop in the bucket. We've got 9,000 high school dropouts in the city of Detroit, and we've got to do something to turn the tide. And you can appreciate this more than any of us as a jurist, to turn the tide so that they don't end up in court.
Oh, having a job is vital. Having, an economic foundation, a financial foundation that you can rely upon, and that also you take pride in. You have a job, you take pride in getting up, going to work. It's a sense of self-esteem, self-worth. It's more than just a paycheck. And if you don't have that, then yes, idle minds can can get into trouble. And you don't want that. So the domino effect of the growth for this region, if it brings more jobs, then I think you probably could also see likewise a decrease, in the number of incidents and crimes across the city.
Now, I've got to ask you an important question, and I'm inviting the listeners to call in on this one because this is really a question that I didn't prepare them for.
Uh-oh.
When you
A
said,
curveball.
not really a curveball, it's straight, it's straightforward.
Okay.
I want to know, how stressful is it to be a jurist and have to make decisions? Because I don't think our listeners understand that it's not an easy job to be a jurist and wear a black robe and make decisions about the fate of other people.
Yes. To sit in judgment is a heavy responsibility. Very often people, it's easy to say, well, if I would do this or I would do that. But when you are actually have been entrusted to be the decision maker, And as a judge, there's a sense of finality to the dispute. And so you want that degree of finality to be the right call. I know right now, I mean, I'm an advocate. I've kind of come full circle. I'm a defense attorney, and I'm an advocate. And as an advocate, I'm there fighting with all my heart and passion for the interests of my client. Just as your opponent should be doing the same thing. But as a jurist, it's a little different. I mean, you have to cipher through the emotions and the passions of both sides and really try to dissect to do what is right. What is your definition of right and wrong? And you have the law as your playbook, you know, to make a decision by. But by no means is it an easy decision, an easy job, because you are dealing with people's lives, their futures, and if you get it wrong, you know, the consequences can be devastating.
You send somebody to prison and you don't want to send them to prison, and it becomes a major issue. Now, fortunately, our Supreme Court has gone a long way on the sentencing guidelines to allow you to deviate from the sentence.
Right. Which is I applaud, because when I sat on the bench, I mean, you really don't necessarily want to be in a straitjacket. You want to have discretion. Discretion to fashion a remedy or a sentence that will fit the crime and fit the individual and take into account different competing circumstances. And in the balance of punishment and compassion, you know, the hands of punishment and rehabilitation, all of these things are mixed in the pot. And so it's really, I think, important to have judges who I think are products of the community, who have a pulse of the community, and who are not just going to be robots. And guidelines, I think, have more of a tendency to place you in the category of a robot than actually taking into individual circumstances into account.
We're going to take a break for a minute. We'll be right back. Please call in with questions today, because we're going to talk about more of the stresses of being on the bench.
All right.
My cousin was a judge.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Call 1-800-529-8721. That's 1-800-LAW-USA1. And watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. That's Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law. Saturdays at 10 a.m. here on WHPR Detroit Live.
An example of how the system can work against an individual and you have no control because of the statutes. We have an individual who is a convicted felon and he comes back before you
Right.
with a new charge, and he or she is in possession of a gun. So there's a mandatory requirement that that individual serve at least a minimum of 2 years in jail. Is that correct?
That there are mandatory prison sentences for some gun offenses. You are correct. For instance, if you are in possession of a gun, if you are committing another crime, like it's called felony firearm, you know, there's a robbery. If you have a gun, you rob, that's you. There's 2 years automatic for the gun, plus time for the armed robbery, and the time for the gun is stacked. It's consecutive to the time for the armed robbery. And if you're a repeat offender on a gun offense, you're right. The mandatory minimum sentence can go up on that gun charge. And when that happens, quite frankly, the judge is in a straitjacket. I mean, you have to follow, because by law, it dictates that the sentence must be X.
Well, there's one option. Fortunately, we have a gun board.
Mm.
And many of our listeners are not aware of the gun board, but an individual who's charged with possession of a firearm as the offense can go before the gun board, and there may be circumstances, extenuating circumstances, which explain away the possession of the gun
Right.
and may give them the opportunity to have the charge reduced. But that's a few, that doesn't happen very often. They're few and far between. But in those cases where you have to send people to jail, how much sleep do you lose? I want our listeners to understand that the guy in the black robe, the lady in the black robe sitting up there, they're not mean individuals. It's a very stressful position. How much time do you have to spend, how much time do you lose sleeping, toiling over this?
You spend a lot of time, I remember I was on the bench, preparing for the sentence. So it is not a knee-jerk decision. Sometimes, I would like to, sleep on it before I even have to make I want to make a decision if I'm, upset, So, but judges are human beings, and they're subject to the same emotions as everybody else. However, when you are imposing a sentence, again, you are balancing. There's two sides to a coin. There's a victim as well. There's someone who's been victimized, and so you're trying to honor that interest and balance that interest against sometimes extenuating circumstances of the offender, and that's where the challenge comes in. Is where do you draw that line? Sentence guidelines can assist in giving you some direction of where you need to go. But very often, in terms of serving a prison sentence, there's an old saying: don't do the time. Oh, don't do the crime if you can't do the time.
We know that now, and that raises an interesting issue. We passed law in Michigan in the last year dealing with wrongful convictions. And now we have legislation that affords individuals who've been wrongfully convicted the right to make a claim in the Michigan Court of Claims to receive $50,000 a year. Now, recently, individuals have been bringing suits against the state for compensatory damages to be compensated in addition to the $50,000 that they've received for spending time in prison. And if you recall the O.J. trial and how important DNA became,
That's true, yes.
and how DNA set the stage for many individuals who were wrongfully convicted to prove that they didn't commit the crimes.
Right.
So how do you feel about this wrongful conviction legislation, and what do you think our listeners should know about this? Because there isn't a month that goes by that I don't get a call, can somebody help my boyfriend because he was wrongfully convicted? Can somebody help my girlfriend? She's serving time in prison and she was wrongfully convicted and they didn't commit the crime.
Right.
Tell me how you feel about it.
Well, I feel very encouraged that there is an avenue in which that can be addressed if there is a claim of a wrongful conviction, because the time that you are spending, you can't get that time back. I mean, if you spend 5 minutes in jail, you can't get that 5 minutes back. So if that prison sentence is being served unjust, without proper reason, and there's exculpatory evidence out there, evidence that points to your innocence, that may not have been known at the time in which you were sentenced. I think fairness, fundamental fairness, due process in our system, thank God, there is an avenue in which that can be heard. Thank God for the advancements of DNA, because if DNA shows convincingly that this was a wrongful conviction, then that should be brought to the attention of the trier of fact. And I'm glad that there's an avenue in which that can be addressed. And then, a judge, you can distinguish between DNA, scientific evidence, and sometimes, in all due respect, lay testimony, where people can come in years later and say, oh, no, Johnny didn't do it. Johnny, well, why don't you say that when this happened? So having scientific, proven, reliable, credible evidence to show that a conviction is wrongful, I'm glad there's a way in which that can be addressed.
Now, in terms of compensatory damages, as you pointed out, you can't bring back that time that you've been away from your family. You may have children that you don't see grow up.
Wow. Yeah.
Your spouse, God forbid, may have passed away. Your parents may have passed away. All of those life cycle events in your family you've missed because you've been detained by society.
Right.
Should you be entitled to bring a lawsuit and be compensated for that? And I'm asking you this as a jurist now, because you did sit on the Court of Appeals.
I sure did.
The Court of Appeals handled the Court of Claims.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all the claims go to the Court of Claims in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And we changed the rules at the Court of Claims with specific judges handling Court of Claims cases from the Court of Appeals now. So how do you feel about that?
Being compensated.
Yes.
I think that there, from a fairness standpoint, that should be an opportunity to be rewarded monetarily. Now the amount may be, subject to debate, but I think amongst the list of damages, that is something which should be addressed. Now you have to also, to me, distinguish between a wrongful conviction and, for instance, a malicious prosecution. If there is no bad faith on anybody's part.
Yeah, let's break this down a little bit.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay, dirty police evidence. How's that?
Now that's bad faith.
Okay, well, I just call it the way it is. I don't mince words. Okay, somebody planted evidence. Somebody decided, well, we want to get this guy over here, and he's committed enough crimes, so it's about time we put him away anyways.
Right.
So we plant cocaine on him.
Yeah. No. To me, that's a different. You're right. If there's planting of evidence, if there's intentional bad faith, that's maliciousness, and the prosecutor knew about this and went ahead and prosecuted, or if this just came out later, even unbeknownst to the prosecutor, and it's shown that bad police conduct led to the conviction, then yes, I think that's entitled to compensatory damages.
Now, I know you had to deal with these issues when you were our United States Attorney for this district. You had to deal with planted evidence. I know you had cases that were there and where the convictions were not where they should be.
Well, if it was ever presented to me, evidence in which attorneys in the office or agents, the law enforcement agencies that we were working with did something unethical, I would not allow that. I remember in particular a terrorism trial that we had here in the Eastern District of Michigan, which resulted in a guilty verdict, first one in the country, for material support of terrorism. And it came to light later that the lead prosecutor on the case did not share all of the discovery, all the exculpatory information.
That's why I brought it up. I know you're aware of that one. Okay.
Bullseye. But to finish the story, we moved to have that conviction set aside because we thought that jury verdict was contaminated. So, and it was set aside. So I think if conduct like that comes to light, then you are duty bound to take action to prevent further injustice.
Now we're going to take a break for a minute, and I want to talk to you about federal expungement because
Sure.
this is a horrible area and nothing has been changed. No laws have been changed in this country about pardoning convicted felons in the federal system since the law was enacted. We'll be right back.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Call 1-800-529-8721. That's 1-800-LAW-USA1. And watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. That's Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law. Saturdays at 10 a.m. here on WHPR Detroit Live.
I began to have a conversation with you about pardons in the federal system. Would you explain to our listeners the difference between state law expungement and federal law pardon?
To get an expungement of a state court conviction, there is a very specific statute or process that you have to adhere to. There's a timeline where you have to wait so many years after the state court conviction to ask for it to be expunged.
5 years.
5 years. And during that 5-year window, you cannot have committed any other, new offenses. Hopefully you have a gainful employment record or other things you can point to show good conduct during that window. And then, based on that, you can move to ask for your conviction to be set aside. Some offenses may not be not eligible for that, but the majority of low severity felonies, I think, within that window, you can do that. Federal court, on the other hand, is a little more difficult.
You need a pardon.
And a pardon is signed by the President of the United States.
Now, we saw the President of the United States pardon a sheriff in Arizona. We didn't like that.
President has a lot of power. And normally, for a pardon in the federal system there's a pardon office. There's a pardon attorney's office connected with the Department of Justice. And you would you submit it to that office, and they, I believe, forward it to the president, make a recommendation, and the president may thumbs up or thumbs down. I have rarely seen them grant it. But the example that you mentioned, is not what I'd expected or would expect.
No, very, very rare situations. I know the president recently pardoned a sheriff in Arizona.
Right.
And we were shocked. We were offended. However, it was done. But the president, as you said, has a lot of power. But under normal circumstances, in order to get a pardon, it's an executive order.
True.
So without the executive order, and let's face it, most of those executive orders require a lot of political pull. and that's the problem here. So, having said that, individuals who were convicted on the federal level very rarely get an opportunity to have their record cleansed. Whereas in the state level, if you get an expungement, that may mean the difference between where you live because it affects your housing.
Right.
It may mean the difference between getting a job and having credit. And that's the problem today because convicted felons cannot get jobs unless their records get clean. Not too many people are hiring convicted felons today.
Mm-hmm. I also think that part of the education on this issue is beyond the legislative issue in terms of changing the law to get a federal pardon. I think part of the outreach should also include is public education as well. I mean, on a job application, you know, asking, you have a prior criminal conviction? There are some states, I believe, would say they don't. That question should not be asked, or only in maybe certain circumstances. But employers, prospective employers, should be more informed about how this person has paid their debt to society, and not use that as a lifetime pitfall, you know, for that person. So I think as a society as a whole, we have to become more understanding of the plight of someone who, yes, they committed an act, bad act, but to complete the story, they have served their sentence, they've paid their debt. So let's move on from there.
That's the point, and that's where the difficulty lies. Now, I noticed in reading your bio and doing a little research on your firm that you handle white-collar crimes.
Yes.
And our listeners really don't understand. You know, you and I know as lawyers what white-collar crimes are.
Mm-hmm.
But our listeners don't understand, probably, for the most part, what white-collar crimes are. So I want you to explain what a white-collar crime is. I mean, by definition, what is a white-collar crime?
Yeah. By definition, white-collar crime is more financial crimes. I do a lot of healthcare fraud cases, public corruption cases, mortgage fraud cases, cases involving public officials, whereas blue-collar crime is more bang, bang, shoot 'em up, or drug cases. And I still handle blue-collar cases as well. Don't get me wrong. I still, your role as you recognize as a defense attorney is not to pass judgment, but to defend. And so I have a wide variety of cases, but our niche has been more of the white-collar representation.
We have a caller. Good morning.
Good morning. Attorney Keller, great show today. Appreciate you taking my call. I have a question. I have a cousin who is an immigrant, and he has been arrested in Ohio by ISIS, and they're threatening to deport him because he has a felony on his record. Can that felony be expunged? Even though he served his time, he's been a pillar of the community. He has 2 kids here. He's raising the kids. The young lady who he had the kids with, she's recently passed away, and these children the only person they have is their father right now.
Yes.
Well, he can file a petition to have that expunged.
That's right.
And if he has no other criminal record, and it's more than 5 years, and he has an exemplary, when I use the word exemplary, he's been a good citizen. He stands about a 95% chance of getting the expungement. The problem is, if he committed the crime a long time ago, and the jurist who was on the bench has either passed away, is no longer sitting, I have to come before another jurist who's going to make the decision. And that's where the difficulty comes in. Because the person, would you agree with me on that?
No, I agree. I mean, there are judges who will come on their successor who may not have the same background knowledge of the case as the original judge who imposed the sentence. But notwithstanding that, if you can show, as Mr. Keller said, an exemplary community record, you say he's a pillar in the community, I would get letters, from third-party support of that statement, and present a nice package to whoever the judge is, showing how this man, that conviction is not a reflection of who he is, and it's over 5 years, then yes, I will move to get that expunged like yesterday. Because by law, if you do have a prior felony conviction, you can be deported. I mean, that's the law. So unless you are very proactive, then that deportation would take place.
And normally I wouldn't make an announcement, but today we're having a law fair over at Wings of Love at 6 in John R. And anyone who needs expungement information should come over. There are at least a half a dozen experienced lawyers who will be there to volunteer their time to assist you and give you free information about expungement, tell you how to proceed, tell you whether you're eligible, and they'll even help you fill out the forms. So we'll be there from 10 to 3. We also have legal information in every area of the law imaginable, with the exception of lemon law, because we're not in the car business. But every other area, we have attorneys there who are experienced, whether it's creditors' rights, landlord-tenant proceedings, personal injury, workers' compensation, Social Security. And we can give you information in all these areas. So come on over to Wings of Love today from 10 to 3. That's at John R. and 6 Mile Road, and we'll be there to assist you. Now, I have to get back to the white-collar crime because I'm really interested in this. You said so much about the different types of white-collar crime. Now, when you represent public officials and they're involved in white-collar crime, let me just give you a scenario. Let's say that I'm owner of a landfill, and I want to have your city do business with my landfill. So I decide to meet with your council people. And I say, I'd like to give you some money if you help me. I'm not saying I'm giving you money for office, but I'm going to give you some money. Maybe you could use it, help your kids go to school. I'm talking straight. This happens.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to buy your wife a new car. But I need your help because I want you to use our landfill, and I want you to use our equipment to get to the landfill. I'm very careful here what I'm saying because I don't want to suggest a particular company, but the point I'm making is, so I say, okay, I'm going to give you some money. And then one council person tells another council person, we've got this fellow over here who's been very generous, and he wants to help our kids go to school, wants to help the kids go to camp, go to college. And he's got some money for us. So a couple of the council people take the money and they get caught. It's a very serious crime, isn't it?
No question about it. I mean, you're talking about a bribe. I mean, call it like it is. Whether or not that is being dangled and offered, in exchange for a favor, can pose white collar implications.
Okay, well, there's a law called the Hobbs Act. And under the Hobbs Act, if a public official takes the bribe, and they can be charged with a felony, can't they?
You can be charged. I mean, it's like a quid pro quo. And in exchange, for any type of favor, trying to exert public influence, that is something which public officials, need to be aware of those consequences. I mean, I wrote a book about a year and a half ago on ethical leadership and making good ethical decisions. And typically, even if it's not the Hobbs Act, there is something within your local ethics ordinance or ethics code of conduct, which would prohibit that. And it doesn't often take a Rhodes Scholar to know if it smells, does it pass the smell test? I mean, and if it doesn't pass the smell test, then that should be a warning sign of buyer beware.
About 30 years ago, I had my first Hobbs Act case, and it was really strange. This gentleman was in charge of maintenance for one of our local municipalities, and a company that supplied all the cleaning materials at Christmas time started sending him gifts. A microwave TV one year, a couple television sets the next year, a trip to the Bahamas the next year, and then all of a sudden he received a subpoena. and he was called down to the grand jury.
That's your new gift.
Yeah, he was.
Oh God.
And he was shocked. He said, "All I did is at the end of the year, the guy was really nice. He liked my family, so he gave me a new TV. He gave me a microwave."
Well,
That you don't have to receive cash. You can receive other
things of value. That's right.
That's the point.
That's right. It doesn't have to be money. No, it could be any thing of value. So, I mean, you just look a few years ago with the big corruption trial involving the former mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick. And after that, the city of Detroit did major reform just in terms of their charter and their ethical rules. A lot of it in response to that. So, by all means, having an ethical compass is important in terms of doing business. But white collar crime to me are money crimes.
Okay, we're going to take a break for a minute. Be right back.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Call 1-800-529-8721. That's 1-800-LAW-USA1. And watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. That's Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law. Saturdays at 10 a.m. here on WHPR Detroit Live.
So, while we were off the air, I asked you to distinguish between political contributions and money gifts to politicians. And I know that there are rules that apply. But I want our listeners to understand this because oftentimes they see the same people next to our politicians and all their projects are getting pushed forward. And I'm not going to go into any of the projects, whether they're buildings or stadiums or parks or houses. But my question is, how do you, as a professional in this area, distinguish between a money gift and a political contribution?
There's nothing unethical about giving a political donation to a candidate of your choice. You can choose to give a contribution in the amount within the limits of the ethical rules. There might be a cap as to how much you can contribute in a particular election cycle. And if you adhere to that cap, then there's nothing at all unethical about that practice. And I wouldn't draw any inference beyond saying there must be something wrong there. Now, there's a difference, and I also think in the course of any political administration, there is a mixture of your political work, not really political work, but partnering with the business community kind of goes in tandem with trying to move the agenda of the city or of your administration. So there has to be a natural connection, I would think. You know, when you are running any municipality, I remember when I was Deputy Wayne County Executive, you know, you want to be able to build partnerships with the business community. Because what's the end game? The end game is, yeah, hopefully there will be stadiums and developments. And what would that do? That will raise the economic value of the region, which is beneficial for everyone. So those type of partnerships, I think are a sign of good business. Now, people should know, like I said, whether or not something passes the smell test and where you would draw the line. I mean, there was that one case where, I think it was the former governor of Virginia, where his case was, he was convicted, but then the Supreme Court of the United States, you know, years later, reversed that conviction. But in that case, the facts, I believe, were there was a contractor paying for the governor's daughter's wedding reception. There were other question marks that you think you would think twice about whether or not that should be done. But if you keep business as business, even though it's in partnership with city government or county government or state government, no, that's how we advance.
The other factor, though, and our public has to understand this, that there has to be even-handed treatment when contracts are given out.
True.
That you just can't give contracts to those individuals who make the large political contributions. There has to be a balance so that the entire community benefits from the contracts, so that the entire community progresses, and not just the few who are making the large contributions. And that's where we're having a problem, because the contractors in Detroit, for example, the minority contractors feel that they've been left out. You know that.
Yeah, you want the bidding process for the awarding of the contract to be fair, and that those who sit in decision-making capacity on those boards that make those decisions awarding those contracts, that there should be a list of criteria or factors, you know, that they take into account. And if a minority contractor is being systematically excluded, then, you know, that raises questions. But I would also think that that even if they are not getting the contract alone, that if they are you can make maybe as a requirement that the majority business, whoever gets the bid, also has to contract with a minority contractor.
You saw the fines at the stadium, for example. Recently there were fines.
Okay.
Because the agreement was that there had to be a percentage of individuals who live in the city, work in the city, hired on the jobs, and they weren't hired at the stadiums. There was over $2 million in fines that they had to pay because they didn't keep the numbers.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
So it's really, really important to understand that while there may be this relationship between the business community and the political community for development, there still has to be a bond there to bring in individuals in the community so they can participate in the contract, share the wealth, share the jobs.
I share the wealth and share the jobs. I think that is that's a fair statement. And you want to have a process that's not tilted that makes that so that doesn't happen. And that goes back to, who do you have in charge? It goes back to the ethical leadership of that political organization and of that business, because I would think that no one wants to have even the appearance, even the appearance of an impropriety.
Now, you're called upon to help make those decisions by business, aren't you?
Used to be more so than now, but maybe years ago.
I know, but now you're put in a position where you're defending individuals in the business community and trying to assess whether there's been even-handed treatment. And that is a term that I use that many of our listeners may not grasp, but we want everybody treated the same way. That's even-handed treatment. So you've got to make those decisions when you're representing someone in a white-collar crime.
Right. Whether or not there was fair treatment, even-handed treatment is an important criteria.
Now, I've got a really interesting question. Your hair is going to go up on your head with this one.
Uh-oh.
Now, you said that you were involved in white-collar crimes involving financial issues.
Right.
So I want you to pretend for a minute that Bernie Madoff called you on the phone.
Ooh. Yes.
We got 3 minutes here. So here's Bernie Madoff, and it's scandalous. I mean, he cheated. He cheated people out of billions of dollars in this country and left people in the street.
Right.
Could you represent Bernie Madoff?
Yes. I could represent Bernie Madoff. And I would do my very best I could for him in evaluating the evidence, the strengths of the case, and the weaknesses of the case. And you know what? If from looking at the whole case, and this is what he ended up doing, which way most federal cases are resolved. It's not by way of a trial. It's by way of a plea. I mean, he didn't go through a trial. He pled guilty. And then a stiff sentence was imposed. So I would think in that instance, within that context, justice was served. Is he entitled to have a lawyer? By all means. That's the way the system operates. I mean, you are not there to pass judgment about, whether or not he's fit for representation. He gets good representation, like a constitutional right to have quality representation. But in the end, the balance of justice, I would think, was served. The problem now with Madoff is collection. That's what's upsetting, is that the victims still have not been fully reimbursed for the fraud. And that is something which, I would not want to be a part of that aspect of
restitution.
It. The restitution.
Right. I mean, oftentimes I have clients that come to me that been involved in Medicare or Medicaid issues.
There you go.
And when they're, the numbers can be astronomical.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're talking $300,000-$400,000, but there's a plan for restitution, and it can be worked out. But when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, it's almost impossible. I want to thank you for coming today.
All right. Hey, I enjoyed it. Thank you for
you.
having me.
Okay, we want you to come back.
I'd love to.
And bring your wife back next time.
She's the Supreme Court. I'll bring the Supreme Court influence.
Okay. Thanks again for coming. You have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Okay. We'll see you next week.